It was supposed to be just another wedding speech. The music was playing, glasses clinking, people smiling. Then my dad's voice cut through the room. "He's just a toilet cleaner, an embarrassment to our family." He said it loud like he wanted everyone to hear. And they did. Some guests laughed. Others just stared at me, sizing me up like I was something small. I didn't react. I just kept my eyes on the table. Then a voice came from the other side of the hall. "Unbelievable. He's on the news." The laughter stopped. Every sound seemed to vanish, except the faint music in the background. My dad turned, his hand shaking, the champagne glass slipping from his grip. It hit the marble floor and shattered. People froze. All eyes on me. I stayed quiet, because the truth was about to speak for itself. The silence in that hall felt heavier than the chandeliers hanging above us. I could feel their eyes moving over me, scanning, searching for answers I wasn't ready to give. My dad cleared his throat, trying to recover. "It's nothing," he muttered to the nearest table, forcing a laugh. Some kind of mix-up. But his voice had lost that confidence. It wavered. Across the room, the man who'd shouted walked closer. He had a phone in his hand, the screen lit up. "I just saw the clip," he said, his voice calm but clear. "It's all over." Guests started pulling out their own phones. Screens lit up like tiny spotlights in the dim room. I watched as expressions shifted, curiosity, surprise, and for some, embarrassment. One woman covered her mouth with her hand. Another whispered something to her husband, eyes locked on me. The bride's father leaned toward my dad. "You didn't tell us?" My dad shook his head quickly, "Because it's not important." But I could see his hands tightening on the edge of the tablecloth. The man was unraveling right in front of me. I just sat there, still saying nothing. Because every second of that silence was working for me. Every tap on those screens, every gasp, was pulling the spotlight further away from his insult and straight onto the truth. Finally, someone near the front broke the tension. "Is this really you?" they asked, turning their phone toward me. On the screen, my face, clear, smiling, standing next to someone who, apparently, mattered. I didn't reach for the phone. I didn't need to. I simply looked at it, then looked at my dad. And for the first time that night, he couldn't meet my eyes. My dad's hand hovered over the empty champagne glass, fingers curling like he needed something, anything, to grip. He didn't drink from it. He just held it as if it could somehow steady the shake in his hands. The room wasn't quiet anymore, but it wasn't lively either. It was a low hum of whispers, broken up by gasps and the occasional buzz of a phone. One woman leaned over to her husband, covering her mouth with her hand as she whispered. A man in the corner tapped another guest on the shoulder, showing him a glowing screen. And there it was again, my face. On every phone. Crystal clear under stage lights, wearing a suit sharper than the one I had on now. I was smiling. Shaking hands with someone important. Holding an award. The whispers grew louder. "He's the youngest to ever." "I told you it was him." "This was just last week." The groom's uncle finally raised his voice. "This man's been in every paper in the state. I read the article myself." Then he looked at my dad. "You should be proud." That single line seemed to echo in my dad's ears. He forced a smile, but his jaw stayed tight. "Of course we're proud," he replied, but it didn't sound like pride, it sounded like defense. I let my eyes drift across the table, stopping on the ones who had laughed earlier. They avoided my gaze now, pretending to be interested in the untouched dessert plates in front of them. From the bride's table, a woman turned toward me. Her voice was softer than the rest. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" I sat back in my chair, feeling the weight of the moment settle in. "Because sometimes," I said slowly, "the truth works better when it walks in on its own." A few people smiled at that. Others shifted uncomfortably. But all of them turned back to my dad. And for the first time he looked smaller than the room he was standing in. My dad's eyes kept darting around the hall, like he was searching for an exit that didn't exist. His usual confidence, shoulders back, chin up, was gone. Now his posture looked defensive, almost cornered. He adjusted his tie, even though it wasn't crooked, and tried to smile at the people nearest to him. But they weren't smiling back. The man who had first shouted about me being on the news stepped closer, his phone still in hand. He wasn't loud this time. He didn't have to be. "I was at that ceremony," he told the group around us. He didn't just win an award, he was the youngest in the state to do it. There were mayors there, CEOs, the governor. I watched the words hit the room in waves. People who had been halfway through a drink set their glasses down. Forks stopped midair. Every head seemed to swivel between me and my dad, like they were trying to piece together why a man who had just been publicly humiliated by his father was apparently someone worth celebrating. The bride's father leaned in toward my dad, his voice low but still audible to the table. "Why wouldn't you mention this? Why introduce him like that?" My dad's answer was a mutter, "It's not as big of a deal as it sounds." But his tone gave him away. It wasn't dismissal, it was fear. Fear that the version of me he had painted for years was slipping away in front of everyone. Meanwhile, the glow from dozens of phone screens filled the hall like quiet spotlights. I didn't need to explain anything. The headlines and the footage were doing it for me. No one could deny what they were seeing. Not even him. One of the guests, a man I vaguely recognized from family events, walked over and put a hand on my shoulder. "You've done well," he said loud enough for the tables around us to hear. I didn't thank him. I didn't even stand. I just gave a small nod, letting the silence that followed stretch a little longer. Because the longer no one spoke, the more my dad's image crumbled. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like the one being looked down on. The clinking of silverware had stopped completely now. Even the servers moving between tables seemed slower, their trays balanced carefully as they tried not to break the tension hanging in the air. The music from the quartet in the corner played on, but it sounded like background to a movie no one was watching anymore. I could see the shift in my dad's face, his eyes darting to familiar guests searching for allies. But the same people who used to nod along to his every word were suddenly avoiding him. No one wanted to be caught standing too close to a man who had just been publicly wrong about his own son. The man who had first exposed the truth was now showing more people the clip. I could hear faint snippets, my name, the words, national recognition, record-breaking, commendation from the governor. The kind of phrases that couldn't be brushed off as a mix-up. The bride herself, still in her seat at the head table, leaned forward to watch. Her veil caught the light as she asked one of her bridesmaids, "Why would his dad say that if it's not true?" It wasn't even whispered. She wanted it heard. And it was. My dad straightened his posture, trying one last time to regain control. "This is his moment," he said loudly, forcing a smile. "We're all proud of him, of course." But his voice was too polished, too rehearsed. It was the voice of a man trying to rewrite the narrative while the ink was still wet. I didn't give him the chance. I stood, slowly, and every eye turned toward me. I didn't raise my glass. I didn't clear my throat. I simply said, "I didn't come here to prove anything." The words were quiet, but the room heard them. They say family should be the first to believe in you. But sometimes, strangers see you more clearly. Then I sat back down. No applause followed. Just that same heavy silence. Only now it was resting squarely on my father's shoulders. My father didn't sit back down. He stayed on his feet, still gripping that empty champagne glass as if letting go of it would make the moment final. His smile had completely vanished now, replaced by the kind of tight-lipped stare people get when they realize the room is no longer theirs. The whispers kept circulating. I could hear them bouncing from table to table. His own father said that? Can you imagine? Why try to humiliate him here? The video of me accepting the award was now everywhere, phone screens glowing like tiny spotlights in the dim light of the hall. Every time someone new watched it, they'd look up at me, then over at him, their expression saying more than words could. The bride's father eventually leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on mine. "Son," he said loud enough for others to hear, "you've made this state proud." That line, "this state," landed hard. It wasn't just family pride now, it was bigger and everyone knew it. My father's shoulders sagged slightly, but he still wouldn't sit. I watched him glance toward the exit, then toward the bar, anywhere but at me. It was almost strange. This was the same man who could command an entire room with a single joke, and now he couldn't even find one person willing to laugh with him. A young cousin walked over to my table, phone in hand. "Why didn't you tell us?" she asked softly. I shrugged. "Some things speak louder when you let them arrive on their own." She nodded slowly, then returned to her table, her phone still showing my name on a news headline. From then on, no one asked my father about me. They asked me directly. And each time, I answered briefly, letting them fill in the rest with what they'd already seen. He stayed standing for another minute, maybe two, before finally sinking into his chair. By then the damage was done. And the one man who had spent years trying to make me small, couldn't take up less space if he tried. By now the wedding didn't feel like a wedding anymore. The music kept playing, the waitstaff kept moving, but the focus of the entire room had shifted. It wasn't on the bride and groom, the cake, or the flowers, it was on the quiet war happening between me and my father. I didn't have to say much. Every time someone came to my table, they came with a different story about where they'd seen me, on TV, in an article, in a photo with the governor. One man even mentioned he'd been in the audience during my speech last week. They gave you a standing ovation, he said, shaking my hand firmly. I could feel my father watching every second of it. The guests who had laughed earlier kept their distance now. Some of them tried to make eye contact, maybe to send an unspoken apology, but I wasn't interested. I just kept my answers polite, short, and controlled, because the less I said, the more the truth stood on its own. At one point, my aunt leaned over and whispered, "He's not used to being the one in the shadow." She was right. My father had spent his entire life being the loudest voice in any room, the storyteller, the man people listened to. But tonight the air belonged to someone else. The bride eventually approached my table herself, bouquet still in hand. "I just have to say," she began, "whatever that was earlier, I'm sorry you had to hear it here." I nodded once. "You didn't do it." She smiled faintly, but it was the kind of smile you give when you realize you've just seen a side of someone you can't unsee. The evening wore on, but the shift never faded. Even as the dancing started, even as the cake was cut, my father's energy stayed low. He danced with no one. He laughed at nothing. And he never came to my table. But I noticed something else. People stopped going to his table too. The man who'd always been surrounded by conversation now sat alone more often than not, the space beside him empty. It wasn't anger I felt watching it happen. It was balance. The years of jabs, the small public digs, the constant underestimation. It was all folding in on him now without me having to lift a finger. And the most poetic part? He was the one who had handed me this moment. In trying to humiliate me in front of a room full of people, he'd built the stage for his own undoing. The night slowly began to wind down, but that heavy shift in the air never left. Guests were collecting their coats, saying their goodbyes, and snapping last-minute photos with the bride and groom. But I noticed how they approached me differently now. No awkward smiles, no pity in their eyes. They shook my hand firmly, looked me in the eye, and spoke with genuine respect. One older man, someone I barely knew, paused before leaving. "You know," he said quietly, "there's a big difference between being known and being respected. Tonight, you showed the whole room which one matters more." I didn't say a word, but I think he knew what that meant to me. My father stayed at his table until almost everyone had gone. He didn't stand when I walked past, didn't try to speak. I stopped beside him, not out of obligation, but because it felt like the final page of a chapter. For a moment, neither of us said anything. He stared at the tablecloth, fiddling with the stem of his empty glass. This was the same man who could once make 100 people laugh with a single line, and now, he couldn't even lift his eyes to meet mine. "You know," I said quietly, "I never needed you to be proud of me. I just needed you not to be ashamed." He didn't answer. Not because he didn't have the words, but because the room and the night had already said them for him. I stepped away, thanked the bride and groom for having me, and walked out into the cool night air. The valet handed me my keys, and as I slid into my car, I could still hear the muffled music fading behind me. Driving away, I realized something. Revenge hadn't been about embarrassing him or proving my worth. It was about letting him see in front of everyone that the person he had spent years trying to keep small had outgrown the box he tried to build around me. And the best part? I never had to raise my voice. I never had to explain myself. The truth did all the work. This story wasn't just about a quiet war between a son and his father. It was about the moment when truth walks into the room and silences everyone. A wedding hall filled with lights, laughter, and noise changed in an instant with one sentence. "He's just a toilet cleaner, an embarrassment to our family." Those words didn't just echo through the room. They summed up years of belittlement and being underestimated. But that night was meant to turn. A stranger's voice broke the rhythm. "Unbelievable. He's on the news." And suddenly every face shifted. The same people who were laughing moments ago pulled out their phones to see a truth I'd never spoken aloud. On the screen, me accepting an award, standing with prominent figures, holding a title no one my age had achieved in the entire state. That's when I learned that sometimes silence is the strongest reply. The longer I stayed quiet, the louder the truth spoke for itself. Eyes in the hall changed, whispers changed, and the attention moved entirely to the man who had spent years thinking he was the tallest in the room. I didn't give speeches or try to prove my worth. I simply said, sometimes the truth walks in on its own and changes everything. That was enough. That night, my revenge wasn't in shouting or confronting him. It was in the moment when my father began to look small in front of everyone. He had spent his life trying to keep me beneath him, but in that one evening, his own words stood against him. Those who once laughed with him avoided his eyes. I learned that respect can't be bought or forced. It must be earned, and when you have it, no one can take it away. This story reminds us that letting truth take its course can be the most powerful revenge. Because when time speaks for you, there's no need for words. Everything speaks on its own.